So it's my great honor to introduce the next speaker. Before I do so, again, a few logistics. Let me remind folks that as you come in and as we take questions from the audience, we will be doing it in writing through cards. We will have runners going up and down the aisles. There are question cards in the back. Take a question card, take a pen, put the question down that you want. During the session, give them to the runners, and then the moderator for each session will be reviewing the questions and asking them of the panelists. Before we start the next panel, State of the Ocean, and notice the hashtag, hashtag SOTO. You'll see hashtags throughout the week as we really look to take CHOW outside of the venue here and bring it to the nation and the world via the internet, through Oceans Live, through Twitter, through Facebook. I encourage you all to use the tools that we now have available. So I'm pleased to begin this session with an introduction of one of the greatest ocean champions in Senate's history, and I dare say the greatest ocean champion that the Senate has in its chamber today. Hailing from none other than the ocean state, Senator Whitehouse has long recognized the importance of the ocean to our nation's economy and history. Senator Whitehouse, along with Senator Lisa Murkowski, established the bipartisan Senate Oceans Commission in September 2011, which provides a venue for management and protection of our oceans and coasts and to stimulate the kind of discussion that we're having here within the chamber of the Senate. Senator Whitehouse is chairman of the Senate Environment and Public Works Subcommittee on Oversight, and he's the co-chair, as I said, of both the Senate Oceans Caucus as well as the International Conservation Caucus. In these roles, he brings the Senate's attention to the most pressing environmental issues of the day and fights for the passage of effective environmental legislation. And as many of you know who have watched C-SPAN all hours of the day and night, Senator Whitehouse has been tireless in his championship of what we need to do on climate change, as I mentioned this morning, the defining issue of our time. Senator Whitehouse's leadership on marine issues is also evident through his continuing efforts to secure funding for the National Endowment for the Oceans, legislation that we hope moves through the Congress this year, and legislation that was announced several years ago right here at Capitol Hill Ocean Week. And I'm also honored to say that it was last year that we honored Senator Whitehouse with the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation's Leadership Award. Graduate of Yale University, University of Virginia School of Law, Senator Whitehouse was U.S. Attorney and Rhode Island Attorney General before entering the Senate, where we're very welcome and very delighted for the work you do there. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Jason, and hello, CHOW. It is always wonderful, yes. It is always wonderful to be here. It is one of the most important things that happens in Washington every year. And I am delighted to be an oceans champion in the Senate. But to be fair, I have to tell you also that I have no choice. Partly because, as Jason said, I do represent the ocean state. But even more than that, I'm married to Sandra Whitehouse, who is a marine scientist and actually knows what she's talking about on these subjects. So your work really makes a difference. And I'd like to make a few quick points this morning before the panel comes on. The first is that if you know anything about the oceans, you know that they are sending alarm signals to us from virtually every corner. And not gentle, mild alarm signals, but screaming alarms for those who are not deaf to those very alarms. For those who are listening, it's really getting a little concerning. And it doesn't matter where you look. You can go to the cold polar seas and you see dramatic changes taking place. You see, particularly in the Arctic, the disappearance of ice sheets that were essential to the way in which animals lived and fed, essential to the whole environment of the far north. You can go to our tropic seas and you see acidification and warming knocking coral reefs down with unprecedented bleaching and outright death of these coral reefs that are the incubators of the sea. We can only afford so much of that. You can go to the temperate seas in between and you see the major pelagic species knocked down by as much as 90% in population. You can go to the very top of the food chain and look at the big predator mammals and find out from research that they are now so filled with poisons, with mercury, with heavy metals, with flame retardants, that when a whale washes ashore in the summer in Rhode Island, a victim of a whale strike or old age or something befalling it, if you tow it back out to sea, you're violating the Clean Water Act. If you crank it up into the back of your pickup and you take it to the town dump, you're violating the hazardous waste disposal laws. We have turned big portions of our major marine mammals into swimming toxic waste. And you can drop to the very bottom of the food chain and witness what acidification is doing to the humble pteropod, which is a species that nobody cares much about. It's a little snail that flitters around in the water, except salmon care a lot about it, and herring care a lot about it, menhaden care a lot about it. It's the foundation species at the bottom of the food chain in a lot of places. And if it falls out, down comes the food chain with it. And the recent report by the Royal Society shows that we're actually decades further down the path of destruction of that species than we had thought. They simply can't keep up making their shells in an environment that is that corrosive. No species does well in an environment in which it is soluble. I think that's probably a safe general observation to make. And when you start very near to my home base in Rhode Island with Narragansett Bay now up 3 to 4 degrees mean winter water temperature, and relate that to the departure of the winter flounder, which has had a 90% plus crash in species availability for our fishermen. Sandra and I used to drive over the bridges and look down and see trawlers working winter flounder. You don't see that any longer because there's no fishery left. It was her graduate research. We used to dive in Narragansett Bay. She even made me go in the wintertime and do research on it because it was that important a species, and now it's gone. And you can go to the farthest part of the oceans, to the Pacific, where there's a garbage gyre that is estimated to be the size of Texas. So north to south, or in the middle, top to bottom of the food chain, near to far, wherever you look, the oceans are giving us these terrible warnings that we have to attend to. They also do one more thing, which is that they warn us about climate change. Indeed, they tell us the truth about climate change. In a world in which climate change denial, sponsored by polluting industries, disgraces our democracy, the oceans are a pure, honest signal. And you'll notice that the deniers will never talk about the oceans. They always want to talk you off into remote areas of computer-generated climate research, atmospheric modeling. Because in that complication, there is the opportunity to confuse. There is the opportunity to mislead. It is hard to confuse and mislead about a tide gauge. It's measured in inches. It's not a theory. And whether it's the tide gauge off Naval Station Newport or the tide gauge off Fort Pulaski, they are all telling us the same thing. The sea level is rising, and it is rising in unprecedented ways. And the reason for it is a link of absolutely solid data and science that leaves no room for denial. Tyndall found out what carbon did to the atmosphere when Abraham Lincoln was coming up and down this street in his stovepipe hat. It's been that long, and it's not contested science. We measure the billions of tons of carbon dioxide we've put into the atmosphere since then. No one has disputed that more than 90% of the residual heat from that goes into the oceans. And unless somebody wants to contest the law of thermal expansion, which nobody has yet on the Senate floor, but who knows, there are still opportunities out there for the deniers. When things heat up, they get bigger, and when they're in a confined basin like an ocean, they rise, and the sea levels are indeed rising, exactly consistent with what the scientists predict. And so it's very important not only that we listen to the message of the seas, that we hear their alarm about their own condition, but that we trust them and use them as the witnesses, as the unimpeachable witnesses of what is really happening with climate change. And I'll close with one point, and I want to push back gently on what I hear John Podesta said, which is that work on a climate bill is stalled in Congress. That's not quite accurate. It's a little bit more complicated than that. We had our all-nighter a little while ago. 32 senators showed up. Only one Republican came to the floor, Jim Inhofe, the man who thinks it's a hoax. And there was a little bit of a burble of noise after that, well, we weren't invited. And if we'd been invited, then more Republicans would have shown up, and there might have been a different point of view than just flat-out denial. So we said, okay, we'll take you up on that, and I sent out a letter to every single Republican senator inviting them to show up last night for a conversation about climate change and how to do something about it. One showed up, Jim Inhofe. So on the surface, it can look like it's a hopeless case in Congress. And you look over at the House, if you think they've repealed Obamacare a lot, look at how many times they've repealed EPA authority. I mean, if you want to see where their real passion for destruction lies, it's with EPA. So it doesn't look good on the surface, but I will tell you this. One of the reasons that those colleagues won't come to the floor is because they know their party's position is a disaster for the party, for them, for the country. And they want nothing to do with it. They do not want this issue to be raised. They do not want it to be discussed. They want it to just lie dormant and quiet. And so it's very important that we keep a bright light of attention on this issue. If you want to know how the party feels about this, look at how Republican voters under age 35 think of climate denial. You don't have to guess. There's a poll that shows you. And in a majority, they believe that climate denial is, these are the words in the poll, not mine, ignorant, out of touch, or crazy. When your own young voters think your party's position on an issue is ignorant, out of touch, or crazy, that is a position whose end is near. And the American public is solid on this. You poll Republicans, you poll independents, you poll Democrats, it doesn't matter. There is 70% support for the president's climate program. I don't know if anybody, you know what a shallow pan feels like when it's in your hands and it's got water in it? You tip it a little and you can get a really big slosh. We are about to get a really big slosh on this issue, I believe, and it's going to move faster than gay marriage. It's going to move faster than a lot of the issues that have seen rapid turnabout, because the public is there, the facts are there, the science is there. The only thing that's not there is that there's a little barricade of lies built around that building by a very narrow group of polluting interests who've put a lot of money into that project. But the castle of denial is built on sand, and the sand is eroding, and its collapse is near. You can't win this fight inside the barricade. You've got to win this fight by raising the issue with the American public and letting that pan slosh a little bit more and wash away the barricade from the outside. And that's what I ask all of you to do. And that's what I've asked the White House to continue to do, and that's what I've asked my leadership on the Senate side and the leadership on the House side to continue to do. We are close to making this work, not because there's a magic key to getting Republicans to vote for it within the confine of that building and its barricade of lies, but because the American public is soon going to say, there is no way we're going to tolerate that kind of a position. So be of good faith and keep the work, because the oceans really are our home, and they are the safety for the planet. And we terrestrial species, even if we're not coastal species like Rhode Islanders, we still count on those oceans. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. As always, you have a home here at Capitol Hill Ocean Week. So our next panel is going to look a little deeper at the issues that were raised by John Podesta and Senator Whitehouse. The next panel, State of the Ocean, is moderated by Dr. Jerry Schubel. Nobody has been working at the intersection, at the confluence of management, policy, communications, and science more than Dr. Schubel has over his career. Currently CEO and president of the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, President Emeritus at New England Aquarium, a very long bio that you could read in your program. It's a great honor for us to welcome back to CHOW Dr. Jerry Schubel.
Thank you very much, Jason. We should have a slide, but it's hard I can't see the monitors from here, although I can up there. For those of you who are right in the front, you may have trouble seeing these monitors. No, okay, we're in good shape. All right, this is the State of the Ocean panel, and we're going to also make an attempt to assess how much of what we already know we are using. We've heard two very informative and inspiring talks, and now we want to dive more deeply. Our panelists, we have a wonderful group of panelists. David Conover, who is the interim VP for research at Stony Brook University. He's the former director of the Division of Ocean Sciences at NSF, former co-chair of the Subcommittee on Ocean Science and Technology. Sitting next to him, Margaret Davidson, who is the senior leader for coastal inundation and resilience at NOAA. She is the former acting director of the Office of Ocean and Coastal Resource Management, and also she was the director of NOAA's Coastal Services Center. Scott Doney is the director of the Ocean and Climate Change Institute at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and sitting next to him is Tony McDonald, the director of the Urban Ocean Institute, Monmouth University, and he was the former executive director of the Coastal States Organization. Four very impressive people, four people who play quite different but complementary roles in the ocean. The ocean is changing. We've heard that from Mr. Podesta and certainly from Senator Whitehouse. It's getting warmer and more acidic. We're losing biodiversity, we're losing fish stocks, and sea level is rising and coral reefs are in jeopardy. Human expectations for the ocean are changing. I think most experts believe that as we go forward, we will look to the ocean for more food, more energy, both renewable and non-renewable, more minerals, more recreational opportunities, more shipping, and more fresh water. Just within the last week, a city in California indicated that it believes it needs to build an ocean desal plant. And human relationships with the ocean are changing, particularly for those people who live along the coastline. We've heard that 39% of the population lives there, and they are very vulnerable to a rising sea level. I don't know whether you can read the caption here, but implementing these changes won't be easy. We're pretty set in doing things the wrong way. This is a good follow-up to the comments that we just heard. I'm not so sure that it's doing things the wrong way, but maybe we should shift our emphasis and do it now. This is a schematic that I feel quite strongly about. We refer to it as the ocean knowledge value curve. Down at the lower left, you have data. Moving up the curve, information, knowledge, wisdom, and action. All of these are quite different. Information is not the same as data. The two quotes to distinguish the two that I think are most informative, the late Nobel laureate Peter Medawar said that information is data that has been configured to answer a question or to deliver a message. And Peter Drucker, the late management guru, said that information is data endowed with relevance and purpose. Knowledge is quite different from information, and so is wisdom. Knowledge often it means taking things apart to understand how they all fit together. Wisdom is putting them back together and making decisions that preserves the whole. Some of you may remember in T.S. Eliot's Little Gidding and Four Quartets, there's a wonderful couple of phrases that when he said, "Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? And where is the knowledge we have lost in information?" He didn't say it, but we very easily could have said, he could have easily said, "Where is the information that we have lost in data?" We have increasing amounts of data. Data are at the base of this chain. But unless you drive the discussions up that chain through information, knowledge, wisdom, take action, we haven't accomplished very much. So I want to start by asking our panelists, when you look at this, where does this system break down? We've heard from two people this morning that the system isn't always working. What can we do to reduce the frequency and the impact of the breakdowns of this system? Knowing more is not enough. I'm going to start with Margaret Davidson. Margaret, go for it.
Well, you didn't tell me I got to be the first at bat, but I would say that I think the systematic failure lies between information and knowledge. We push a lot of information out there. We don't always translate it into things that inform our worldview and how we think about our decision processes.
So it's breaking down more between information and knowledge. David, what would you say? Where you've just finished a term at NSF, where do you see the breakdown?
I see part of the breakdown in the difficulty in communicating what we learn from data, translated into information, which can grow knowledge. But then we're still challenged with communicating that knowledge in terms that can actually inform wisdom and action ultimately. And part of the disconnect is that the individuals that are at the lower part of those curves, many of them are scientists at universities throughout the nation. And many of those individuals, the tide is changing, I think, in terms of scientists being more willing to enter the public arena, not just be satisfied with publishing their data in a scientific journal, but actually pushing the next step. Jane Lubchenco is here, has created a program called the Leopold Fellows Program that helps scientists do that. At Stony Brook, we've created the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science to empower scientists to help make that connection. And I think there are more and more scientists willing. And we need a university system that rewards them for doing so, which we don't have right now.
Tony?
I guess I'm going to suggest two things. First of all, I think we actually break down more when you add the factor of change into the equation. That the reality is this is a changing environment. So the relationship between data, information, wisdom, and action actually change fundamentally depending on timescales and questions that you're asked. So in a changing system, I think this breaks down because people want to have a linear way of moving up this chain, and I don't think that actually plays out in reality. And my other general comment, and I made this to you with this, I feel like this is like the upside down food chain. I actually think it should be the other way, where we should value the data and information in ways that actually are more fundamental to action than this sort of graphic sort of suggests. So I think sometimes this suggests and gives the power to the decision makers in a way that I think allows them to disregard information the way some of this is set up.
Well, we'll come back to that because I would disagree with you. Scott, what would you add to this?
Well, actually, I was going to agree with Tony. Tony takes my point. One of the problems is right now is that the scientific community decides what are the important problems, and your diagram is a one-way diagram. We collect data and it goes up the chain. I think, particularly when we're talking about impacts and solutions, we need to engage the stakeholders as not only at the end, not in the communication side, but how we frame the science problems, what we observe, what the science problems we want to look at.
And certainly I would agree with that, and that was what Senator Whitehouse said, talking about the ring that surrounds the Capitol. Somebody's got to get in the moat and kill the alligators. But but on the other hand, it does start data, information, knowledge, wisdom, action. I think that if Senator Whitehouse were here, he would say that it breaks down in the wisdom and action place. A lot of these things, the decisions can be made only by government.
Right.
Margaret, you've been one of them for a long time.
Well, that's why I think the breakdown actually occurs before that, because I think the public sector is actually often too late to the party. Sure. I'll give you an example. So I've been involved with coastal management issues for a long time. It is largely the province of local land use planning and zoning. When a developer, let's see, hypothetical, when a developer has decided, or the Chamber of Commerce has decided on the preferred development site at a cocktail party or at a golf game, they go out and buy that piece of property, and they've invested money with the bankers and the interest and the lawyers and the engineers even before they come to ask for a permit. So we're left dinking with fighting the battle on the margins. So I think we need an intervention strategy, that's what I'm calling for, so that we're actually working with the people to reshape how they think about things like, for instance, preferred development sites. And so that's why I joke that we push a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of information out there. That doesn't mean that it gets picked up. That doesn't mean that it gets used. It doesn't even mean that it's relevant. So I think the scientists are great. We need discovery. For instance, we wouldn't be listing so many deep sea corals if it wasn't for the ocean exploration program telling us 15 years ago that we actually had some in those spots. And they were just out there looking. But we also do need things that are from the get-go intended to actually help us advance the ball, very applied. So when you talk about engaging stakeholders, I think we need to engage them not just in the definition of the problem, but even how we think we're going to go out and collect the data.
Oh, yeah. The whole.
So I certainly would agree. I moved away from academia because I believe that the public has to be better informed and be engaged in all of these issues. David, you look like you
Let
want.
me add something to that. I think the senator was talking about this translation of wisdom to action here in Washington, right. But I think it's a somewhat different story on a regional basis. And I'd like to give you an example from Suffolk County, the outer two-thirds of Long Island, where Stony Brook is located. Right. The county executive of Suffolk County has declared that the number one problem for the county is nitrogen-based groundwater pollution, which is causing harmful algal blooms, undermining the productivity of shellfish. But most importantly, and this relates to the effects of Sandy in this region, is it's damaging the marshes, which actually are the natural barrier that protect the main parts of the island. So here's a regional politician that actually has made that his way up through the top of that, ready to take action. And in fact is going to start sewering districts, putting more homes on sewers, and actually changing the kinds of septic and cesspool systems that now are existing on Long Island so we can reduce the nitrogen level. And he's not doing it, I think, purely because he's seen the light, but because he thinks his constituents want to see this happen. So I think you can see lots of examples probably on regional scales where that translation is happening.
And I think that's a very good point. We'll come back to that later, because I think we have to highlight some of these success stories. People are getting tired of talking only about threats. They're looking for opportunities and success stories. But to me, when I look at this curve, the data, information, and maybe halfway up to knowledge, or maybe sometimes all the way up to knowledge, That's the domain of research and researchers. And the place where we still break down, without ascribing any blame to anyone, is in the wisdom to action at the national level. Anybody disagree with that? Not at the regional, not at the local, at the national level.
I only disagree to the extent that we look to the national level to make those actions. I think increasingly that is changing. So I actually do think that the reality of the national level action as being the driver, I think not only by inaction, but I think by deliberate choice, we're getting federal agencies telling us we actually are not in the action business. And I actually think increasingly you're seeing the NGO sector, the private philanthropy sector in research and action, and I'm a state and local guy, that's really my background, we've been moving in that direction for a while, but I actually do think, I'm only disagreeing with to the point, I actually think what's happening is we actually do have an opportunity to look at different actors than perhaps we tend to when we come into DC for Capitol Hill Ocean Week.
And I think that's a good point. Partly maybe it's because of frustration on our part with the lack of action, because there still are some things only government can do. If you can't read the caption, it says, your proposal is innovative. All of you have innovative ideas. Unfortunately, we won't be able to use it because we've never tried something like this before. That sounds like government to me. Margaret? Margaret, don't take that drink. You've been one of them a long time.
Well, I think,
Saying that.
yes, I are part of the problem, Pogo. I think it's kind of like that thing that sometimes has been erroneously attributed to Einstein and falsely misquoted, so I will continue that tradition, that his definition of insanity was doing things the same way and expecting a different result. So I think it is the nature in particular of Fedlandia, but I won't just leave it with the feds, but I think it is the nature of Fedlandia to be inherently conservative. It is inherent in the federal papers that we are conservative, particularly in this part of the government. I think most of the people who come into the federal government find their comfort zone somewhere between 10 to 15 years and find it difficult to consider new grounds. So I think that's a challenge. And we have so many processes that are set up to address the one bad apple in the barrel. So everything is geared to the lowest possible common denominator, and that does not spark innovation. I don't think we were set up to be innovative, frankly. That's why I think that the cultural shift that Tony talked about, in which we recognize the distinct roles of many people across different levels of scale, across many different sectors even, because I do think there's an increasing role not just for the NGO community, but for the private sector. I think that's a really great thing. But we all need to learn a lot more about the importance of boundary organizations and how do we facilitate and enable and empower people to step up.
But if the federal government wasn't set up to innovate, wasn't it at least set up to nurture innovation, to allow it to happen? And are we doing that? David, I've heard
that was supposed to be what our science enterprise was about.
And I've heard that with NSF,
I think I left government just in time.
it's hard to fund high-risk research. And often it's because of the reviewers and the review process. What's your comment on that?
Yes, it can be very difficult to fund the extremely novel ideas that are so opposed to the conventional point of view that very few people agree with them. So that is a problem that not only NSF, but the community that we use to peer review proposals, we have that problem in common. And I think what this reflects, and to take a little flack off government, is that the scientific community isn't very transformative either, the way they think about big problems. One idea at a time, yes, but we need to transform the way we fund science and the ratio of things like how much we invest in facilities versus people, and come up with a new business model for how we fund research going forward in the future.
We're going to come back to that. Scott, would you like to add a thought to that?
Yeah, I think one of the problems is in the end, we need to make connections to people in coastal communities. They need to understand how climate change or overfishing is affecting them personally. And we can't just continue doing natural science the way we've done it and try to communicate it. I think part of the problem is we don't have enough information on how this does actually affect people and how we can get them to relate to their everyday experience.
So we need more social scientists.
I
Tony and then Margaret.
But it's not only social science. I think that's an element of it. But I guess two observations. Back to the original question, that slide to me is really about inertia. And I think inertia is, the scientists will tell me, is something actually real and scientific. And I think it exists differently in universities, moving from PIs to investigative. It exists in government for a variety of different reasons. Some of those reasons aren't necessarily bad. So I think there's that aspect of inertia, but you need to understand where the different groups come into the equation. I also, though, think, to Scott's point, that this is kind of what I call a little bit the sort of IMAX film problem we have right now in the ocean, which is either you have these beautiful films of fantastic abundance and wonderfulness, or disaster films. The space that Scott wants to get to, where people and places connect to problems, is not something that we do a very good job of either researching in a consistent, ongoing way. Margaret and I come from a little bit of the brown water background. You know, people still don't like the coast. It's still messy, the estuaries, you know? That you mentioned the nitrogen issue. I'm sorry, but we were at Airlie, whatever that was, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and the same list of needs is out there. So I would suggest that it's in that middle range where people exist and problems exist, that perhaps we need a better job not only in the research, but in then translating that to people and getting them involved.
Margaret.
But Jerry, it's not just the shortfall of the public sector. It's not just the shortfall of the universities, because I think there's a larger systemic problem here. That is, particularly in this country, but not unique to this country, just especially so, we are actually disinvesting in science. In the private sector, Skunk Works, IBM Lab, we could name a handful of those things. All those areas of capabilities have also deteriorated in the last 10 to 20 years. In the UK, they tore down their science enterprise a few years back, some woman named Thatcher, and they've actually just spent the last 30 years rebuilding it. And they're tearing it down and reconstructing it again in Australia. I mean, denialism isn't just limited to climate science. It's actually our anti-intellectual roots in this country that we need to address.
All right, we're going to come back to that. I've been told we should announce that we will be going to 12:10 because we got a late start, so don't flee the room, please, at 12 o'clock. And I have a number of questions that we will get to. But let's take a look. This is a figure. The Ocean X Prize had a meeting about 2 weeks ago, and there were 35 people there. And if you look at on the now, the ocean was characterized as being unhealthy, overlooked, and a mystery. And the idea was to, in the future, we would like to have the ocean healthy, valued, and understood. And the question is, how do you get from what we have now to the future? And it's interesting that both of our speakers this morning talked about the importance of awareness. And I invite each of you to give me one idea of how to get from now to the future and to make a difference in the next decade or so. In any of those or all of those categories. Who'd like to start?
Well,
Scott.
I'll start. One of the things we're trying to do is really engage people in the science. You know, that science is not some external force that comes in and collects data. So we're trying to work with the fishing communities, with coastal communities, where they're actually collecting the observations, involved in the interpretation, and then they're drawing their own conclusions about what action needs to be made.
So partnerships, and included in that might be citizen science, but wouldn't have to be. Who has another one? David,
I
and then
would
Margaret.
flip that as well and reemphasize that it's equally important that we have scientist citizens, that scientists themselves recognize they have a civic responsibility to do more than just do their research and put it in a journal. It's the flip side of what Scott was just talking about. Those two, that's where we can meet in the middle between citizens that want to actually engage in scientists and scientists that want to engage in citizen activities, not just those citizens themselves, but in translating the science they do into forms that can make it useful for policymaking.
Tony?
I guess I'm the maybe contrarian of the panel, but I feel like we have to say right now the future is now. What do people perceive that is healthy, valued, and understood about the ocean? How do we build on that based on a different future, not a backward-looking, how do we correct those problems? So to me, the future's now, and then how do we want it to be in the future? And that way you're really generating sort of a really positive agenda based on people's already, I think there is a high value. The polling all sort of suggests that people do value the ocean, but that's not translating into the types of actions that I think we're looking for.
Remember, Will and Ariel Durant, the historian, said the future never just happened, it was created. And we will create the future. We will either do it thoughtfully and purposefully, or we will do it unintentionally. Margaret.
So this is a little more pedestrian. NOAA has the unique privilege among mission agencies to be located in something called the Department of Commerce, which is so appreciative of resource mission requirements.
I was just looking over here. The secretary has left, the former secretary.
But
So you're safe.
one of the things that does happen at the Department of Commerce that everyone seems to hang with bated breath waiting for is leading economic indicators. So it's only taken us 15 years, but now NOAA is working with the right people in the Department of Commerce to come up with a leading ocean economic indicator. Now, I think there are challenges when you try to distill that down into a single economic number, but the reality of life is until we, inside this capitalist system that we have, until we have a number that's a leading economic indicator to go along with all those other numbers that are so important to all the capitalists, then it will never be sufficiently valued by the big decision makers, which is a different issue than how do we value it as individuals and citizens and people who have to breathe. But I think you have to do both the macro as well as the personal value issues.
All right, anybody else have an idea of how to move from now to the future? All right, we'll leave it at that. But I think to a first order approximation at least, mystery to understood, that's a domain of research, but it also extends over into education, translating data into information and knowledge. In the education, clearly, is what's important in this idea that it's overlooked and to it being valued, and it's public education, and it isn't just university and colleges. It's not even just K to 12. It's lifelong learning and public education. And at the top, it is action. Now, it doesn't always have to be at the federal level. It can be at the regional level, and it can be at the local level, but it does take action. All right, here's one of my favorite cartoons. And you heard Senator Whitehouse. We came out of the ocean. Or they were, I guess, quoting Bill Clinton. And we did. We've evolved. And look what we've evolved to. So this is a cartoon. The caption says, they give you a lot of treats while they're training you. So play dumb for as long as you can. Now, do we sometimes, if not play dumb, do we talk too much about disasters and not enough about opportunities? Are we following this cartoon? Margaret, have you played dumb all these years?
It is a natural, I'm happy to play dumb for you. It is a natural instinct to try and use whatever moment. The scientists refer to disasters as galvanic opportunities, and sometimes during crisis we actually do move the needle. But that has actually fallen off in recent years. And the thing we know about most people, particularly younger people, is that stories of possibilities sell so much better than Chicken Little. So I think we have to be mindful of reality, but we also have to give people the light over the horizon, else why are they going to run towards it?
Anybody want to add anything to that? That's what everybody tells us about stories and myth-making and Joseph Campbell and the power of myth. You can drag people down to the depths of despair, but at the end, you've got to give them some hope.
Well, it preceded Joseph Campbell.
Well,
there was this little guy called Homer.
Yeah, and it probably even preceded your friend Homer, who you went to high school with. But go ahead, Scott.
Jerry, I think there are some good examples. You know, we talked this morning about issues of ocean acidification occurring in the Pacific Northwest. What wasn't mentioned is that the hatcheries have been working with scientists coming up with solutions using observations and changing what they're doing, adapting to climate change. And I think that's one of the messages, is we need to come up with solutions where we can adapt to a changing environment and learn as we go along.
And that's a great example because of scientists working with the shellfish growers, changing the times when they pumped so that, because the pH changed, over the course of a day, and they changed the times that they pumped, and the mortality of larvae went way down. Who else would like to make a comment
Well,
here?
I think that a couple of things. I do think that implicit in this slide as well is the reality is we do create sort of a system that reinforces self-interest. So researchers like what they got and want more of what they got, even though they know maybe they should change. Programs know that perhaps they're not addressing tomorrow's priorities, but they don't know how to go there. Creating that safe space to be flexible in order to be strategic, not necessarily transformational, although you also want that transformational change at the same time, I think is a real critical issue that doesn't get discussed enough, and it's not enabled because I do think the current systems at the academic research side, at the governmental side, tend to reinforce self-interest, and that's okay. I'm a small player in this big ocean research game here, but people get very jealous when I get a little money, and I'm like, okay, I'm not taking money from you, but I'm not kidding. I mean, it's really insane. I mean, it's just crazy. So I do think that that's an aspect of this playing dumb. It's not so much playing dumb as playing like, I'm afraid to give up. And I'm going to actually say it's not just governmental. I'm going to bring the private sector as well. I do think the private sector likes to complain about the laws, but better the devil you know. It's very difficult to work sometimes with the private sector to talk about a different management regime. We haven't amended environmental laws in 30 years because there's no way we can find to have that dialogue between that, because even though they want to complain it, and the senator mentioned about disemboweling EPA, they don't necessarily want to have what I would call a balanced dialogue about what the alternative might be, even though they want it.
David?
Yeah, coming back to this issue of are we proclaiming too much gloom and doom and not providing enough inspiration? I think that's an area where we could actually do a better job, although we're making progress, with collaborating with artists and people in the realm of literature, because it's not enough to inform people. You have to make them care and inspire them that a difference can be made in the future. And scientists aren't always the best voice to be used to carry that story, but we can collaborate with those who are good at storytelling and inspiring people to care through art, through literature, and reach more people in that fashion.
And we don't do enough of that. I would totally agree with you. Okay, before we go to the questions from the audience, I'd like each of you just tell us one thing that you would recommend so when CHOW takes place next year, things will look better for the ocean. What would be the one thing that we might push hard on as a community for the next 12 months? Who wants to start?
Well, since a senator is a big proponent of the National Endowment for the Oceans, I would like to see a portion of that mythical fund. I hope we actually do get something like that one day, since we are generating actually the wealth stock for the whole planet. But I'd really like to see something inside of that that's set up for innovation, not just to fund things we already have, but as Tony alluded, there are no incentives. I've been very involved with the prize process inside the federal government. We've been very big on prizes lately. And there's some interesting things that have happened, and I've watched the Smith Foundation, I've watched some of the other things happen. But I've seen, outside of Elon Musk, I've actually seen very few things that are transformative. And so how do we actually leapfrog, not just do a better job, move incrementally, but since we're stuck in this place, how do we create totally different kinds of incentives inside the public sector, inside academia, with the private sector? How do we actually grow the green economy? I think that's one of our bigger challenges, because if we generate more jobs making a healthy ocean happen, then I guarantee you that a lot of my friends in South Carolina will also be there.
Clay Christensen of the Harvard Business School captured that when he said we need disruptive strategies, disruptive technologies. Incremental change doesn't work. Exactly. It's through these disruptive strategies. Anybody want to add to this before we go? Well, let's see. I want one idea.
One of the things I think that's very important for us to do in the next 12 to 24 months is to support the National Ocean Policy. And that's not just because I helped work on that, but because, and it may have flaws, it may not be as bold as we wish it were, but it is our National Ocean Policy. It is a platform through which science can be translated into policy. And it's very important, I think, that it have enough legs and have demonstrated enough success and support so that when we go to the next administration, the new administration will embrace it. I think it's a wonderful platform. We wish we had a national climate policy, but at least we have a national ocean policy. And I think continuing to support that, even though it's not perfect, is really important over the next several months so that it lasts.
And coastal and marine, or just marine spatial planning, is an important part of that, I think, that can take advantage of the data, the information, the knowledge we have, and make better decisions. Scott?
Well, a little bit smaller, but I want to follow up on what Dave's point was, that we need to change the culture of how we train academic scientists, research scientists. So maybe one of the things we could do is have, at this meeting, where are the future leaders of ocean research? Where are the graduate students, the postdocs? We need to engage them now, not when they're 20 or 30 years into their career.
But then I think that goes back to a point David made earlier. We have to change the rewards structure then in universities to acknowledge the legitimacy and the importance.
If you engage them now, they're going to be the ones that are going to change.
I agree.
Dave's not going to change the world, but maybe they
All right, neither are you, Scott. But I do think the new generation, the young faculty that I hired while I was dean there, that is actually, those people are empowered, they're engaged, they're enthusiastic about actually addressing these problems. And I think it is the younger members of the scientific community that will be the ones that carry all these initiatives forward.
All right, Tony, you get the last word.
I have a kind of crazy dream here, but in the face of what I perceive to be the inevitable increased use of the ocean, ports, offshore wind, oil and gas activity, there's going to be more, regardless of where you stand on the issues. I have this crazy idea where at some point the fish, the fishermen, and the habitat resilience have the foundation. The scientists have given the three of them, those groups, an ability to sit here and say, we have a foundational claim on the ocean, and the scientists can help us explain that in ways that aren't just in terms of Magnuson fisheries debates, but in terms of a broader need for ecosystem resilience.
Good, all good points. All right, we're going to take some questions from the audience. This one is directed at me, and the question is having a moderator that makes blatantly anti-government, sexist, and
Thank you, Sandra.
ageist comments a helpful way to create productive conversation? I ask you, Margaret.
Ecosystems have a lot of diversity. We have to put up with many archetypes.
And they tend to, and productive, healthy ecosystems tend to be quite resilient. This is a very resilient panel.
Systems that turn over regularly are the most resilient.
All right, the next one was Fedlandia and the Peter Principle. Have we risen to the level of our own incompetence? Who would like to address that?
Well, I think we rise to the level of expectations. I think that's true for every segment of society. And if the expectations for the federal government are what they seem to be, then I think we can meet those expectations, and that's the tragedy.
Okay, anybody want to add to that? Scott?
Let's talk positive for a moment.
Okay.
I think Dave's a good example of a stellar research scientist who has come to DC and spent time here and tried to make a difference. And I think that's something we need to do, is engage the academic community in the functioning of the science enterprise and the science policy enterprise. And there are very few people who are willing to do that.
That cultural thing is very important.
I'll add to the positive tone, too. I also think, I've been in the business about 20 years, but it's transformational now, the way we can represent and show science. The power of modeling, the power of ecosystem understanding. 10 years ago, wow, we can't do ecosystem. Yes, you can. We can actually do things in ways that really are potentially transformational. So I do think the tools and the data integration and some of that work is really, we are at a point where actually folks like me who are more on the policy side can actually work with the scientists, I think, and engage the public in a more effective way.
All right.
If I could add just one thing to that, which is if there's one area where I think incompetence might be deserved, it's that we don't do a good job of speaking with one voice throughout the ocean science community. Not just within the academic community, there's a challenge, and that's what I observed during my role at NSF, but also it's broader than that. It involves the academic community, the NGO community, the industry partners that we have, all of us that are stakeholders in the ocean have to be able to come together and speak with one voice. And if we can do that, it's far more powerful.
And other communities have done it better than the oceanographic community. All right. How do we make ongoing ocean issues and science newsworthy? Give me a soundbite, a hook to sell it to the media and the public. How do we make ongoing issues, ocean issues and science newsworthy? Anybody have a bumper sticker, a soundbite?
Oceans are the 401k for life.
There you go. That's 401. All right. All of you have been bringing up the importance of engagement, translating our science to policy and communication. Any suggestions on where we can gain these skills and who we can reach out to help us? Who would like to comment on that? The importance of engagement, translating science to policy. Where can we acquire those skills?
So I think we have to start with the funnel, and that is the really young people, and not just inside our schools, because of course we've been starving them as well. But for instance, inside things like after-school programs, things that the Y runs or other kinds of organizations, I think there are things that we can do to make science more interesting and, frankly, less nerdy. So we have a bigger pool, a more representative pool to begin with, which is still a problem even when I look out in this room, and I am delighted to see almost half of the room is under 40, so that's a great accomplishment, Jason. But I think we have to increase that into the funnel. And then I think we have to recognize, to borrow you, we need to spend less time on niche competition and more time on understanding niche complementarity as we move through the funnel.
I think I spent a good bit of my time working on community resilience and sea level rise in Sandy in New Jersey, as you might imagine. There's actually some pretty wonderful work going on with regard to access to information that actually funnels down from the federal level that actually get to more localized tools and more community-based tools and information. So I do think, again, it is a little bit the state-local framework, but it's the feds as enablers of that, and then allowing the NGO sectors and the academic sectors to engage that. So I think you'll find a lot of really good examples, I think, that are really coming into play right now after Sandy around community resilience and sea level rise and climate change. And you have discussions about, pretty broad scientific issues at a very local and I think very transparent level.
And we saw the importance of social capital after Sandy. We saw it in Katrina. When you're trying to rebuild, social capital is very important.
At the university level, there are more and more universities that I think are adding science communication to part of the degree requirements at the graduate level. And there are more and more universities that are now offering master's degrees in something called conservation science or ocean conservation, which are not the traditional do a thesis and become a researcher degree, but actually are giving students the knowledge to be good communicators, to be at the interface between science and journalism, for example. So there are opportunities that are slowly opening up, I think, to get that kind of training.
Scott?
And Jerry, if I just may, the way we train scientists is we train them to be experts on a very narrow field. There were only about 5 people in the world who could read my doctoral thesis, or would care to read my doctoral thesis. I think we need to change the way we train people. Yes, we need depth in areas of expertise, but we should be producing students at the undergraduate level, the graduate level, who are comfortable talking about the whole range of ocean science issues, not a very narrow topic.
Good point. A connection to people in coastal communities is not enough. This person's from Arizona. Over 28 states have no coastal access. How do you plan to engage these citizens, support their knowledge of the importance of ocean science? How do we get to the people?
Well, first of all, I would like to point out the Great Inland Coast encompasses about another dozen states. Some refer to it as the Mississippi River, but it actually does behave like a coast, and I frankly think they should be part of the National Coastal Management Program. But the reality of life is, for instance, the Aquarium of the Americas is in some place like Iowa.
No, Aquarium of the Americas is in New Orleans.
No, the one that's up-
Mississippi River Museum and
that one.
Aquarium is in Dubuque, Iowa.
There we go. The one in Iowa. That's my point. The point is that we are all connected by our watersheds, and our watersheds connect us to the source of water and life, and that we shouldn't leave our thoughts and our actions right there in the brown water strip, that we do, in fact, have to engage people in Warren Buffett's hometown. I mean, that's why people like you are actually useful.
Now,
Sorry, I had to get
There we
my
go.
head.
I want that person who sent the thing insulting me to make a note. All right. The curve addressing an exclusively rationalistic scientific analysis, but they raise the question, rationality alone does not drive decisions or action. We need values too. How do values fit in to all of this decision making? Who would like to say a word? Scott?
I think there's a lot of evidence that when you talk to people, the way they interpret what you say is based on their value system.
Yes.
And you know, you can't attempt to undermine their value system. You have to reach out and try to understand what their value system is, and then frame how you're communicating it to connect with them better.
I think that's even true of some climate deniers with their value system. We may not share that. Go ahead, Tom.
But I also think, this is kind of an odd defense, but I actually think laws and regulations reflect our values. We've lost track of the fact that actually laws are not things that are imposed because they don't represent popular will or values or science or information. Right. We may question whether in any given instance it plays that way, but I actually think values is just a slightly broader, it's not just a moralistic concept, it's a value of community sense and community principles, and that actually is reflected in governance, and that's probably a fundamental thing that we need to get back to, as well as the kind of values that other folks are talking about.
So values are they determine who we vote for, the actions that we take.
Well,
Margaret?
you talked about social capital early. Everything we know about resilience is that it's one of the cornerstones for community resilience, however you define that. But the thing about it is you have to always be nurturing and building social capital. That is how you hold that conversation, how you increase the number of people who might identify themselves as being even interested in your ideas. So we all have to do that. That's why this scientist as citizen is actually such an important movement.
So I want to add one other group. I talked about artists and those in the literature, but I think also those in religion, in the evangelical community, we can present them with a moral question about, don't we have a responsibility to protect the species that exist on Earth? And I think you can actually make a lot of headway with that argument, because I think there are people that do feel we have a moral responsibility to not allow species to go extinct, for example, while avoiding the issue of who created that species in the first place, how it was created.
And Ed Wilson,
It doesn't really matter. The fact is, I think that there's an argument to be made.
Ed Wilson has made that argument very persuasively, I think.
Well,
All right.
Catherine Hayhoe at Texas Tech, Lubbock, Texas, is also evangelical Christian who's done amazing missionary work within her own community on the climate issue.
All right, we have about 3 minutes left. I want to give each of you a chance to make a closing comment, and be careful what you say, Margaret, about me, about my age.
All right. Everyone wants to go to heaven. No one wants to die. But that's the one thing that happens. So in the short run, it's only the short run, and we all need to do the best that we can do to advance this ball, however we can do it. But it's not from our individual rabbit warrens.
David?
I think in closing, I just want to thank the organizers for putting this panel together, and Jerry for you organizing it. It's been really a great pleasure. I also want to say that I did spend 3.5 years in Washington at the National Science Foundation, but working across all the agencies through the National Ocean Policy, and it's great to actually be back here and see many of my friends in the audience. So I would just like to say thank you for inviting me to be part of this.
Scott?
Well, I just want to bring it back to the state of the ocean, the topic of our panel. Climate change is happening now. It's not a problem of the future.
Tony?
I think with regard to the ocean, I think this is sort of a bit, every time we think that it seems obvious to us something should happen and it's not, that means we're not asking the right scientific questions, public policy questions, or other, because obviously it's not apparent to those actors. So I do think we always need to question our assumptions about what, if it's obvious to us, if it's not obvious to other people, there's more science that needs to be done and more work that we all have to do together.
And I would close with a quote from the humorist P.J. O'Rourke, who said, "Everybody wants to save the world, but nobody wants to help mom with the dishes." And I think all of the people on this panel have been helping with the dishes, and we are all better off for everything they do. Thank you all. Tony, thank you.
Great, thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thank you, darling.
Thank you.